Tonight, we move gently into another corner of the past. Not the loud places of war or conquest, but the quieter halls where the stories of power unravelled in silence. History does not always announce itself with fanfare. It often moves in whispers, in glances exchanged behind heavy curtains, in words spoken too softly for the world to hear. Before we begin, I invite you to take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so that these quiet journeys can continue to drift toward you whenever you need them. And in the comments, share your location and the time on your clock right now. It's always remarkable to see those small lights flicker across the world, each of us listening in stillness together, even from far apart. Now let us begin. In the stillness of old stone corridors, long after the candles had burned down to quiet pools of wax, whispers lived where sunlight could not. They lingered behind carved doors and velvet curtains, fluttering like moths caught in the folds of history. The great empires of the world often appeared solid on the outside, armies arrayed in glittering armour, rulers crowned in gold, monuments rising higher than reason itself. Yet behind the palace walls, where the world was not meant to see, voices traded secrets, like merchants traded coin. Every empire, no matter how radiant, carried shadows it could not escape. The shadows were not only wars or famines, though those came often enough. They were softer, quieter, and somehow more dangerous. They began as gossip drifting between servants in dimly lit kitchens, a rumour of a forbidden lover, a hint of a chamberlain growing rich on bribes, a suggestion that the ruler's heir was not truly of royal blood. None of these whispers were spoken in public, and yet they swelled until they pressed against the pillars of power themselves. If one stood close to the heart of empire, the golden palaces of Rome, the tiled courts of Byzantium, the perfumed halls of the Ottomans, or the lacquered chambers of Ming China, one would hear it. A rustle of silks as a lady-in-waiting leaned close to confide in another. A careful clearing of a throat as an advisor repeated, in hushed tones, what should never have been spoken at all. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with these sounds, storing them like treasures or poisons, depending on the fate that followed. What made these whispers so powerful was not only what they revealed, but how they were believed. A rumour could leap more swiftly than an army could march. A single phrase, carried from the lips of a servant to the ears of a general, could twist the course of succession or stain a dynasty forever. One could conquer a city with soldiers, but one could destroy an empire with secrets. Consider the story of rulers who wore crowns heavy with jewels, yet feared the weight of words more than the weight of steel. Behind the glitter of official ceremonies, their palaces were labyrinths of private drama. Jealousy simmered between brothers, who each believed themselves more worthy of the throne. Concubines and queens wielded influence in ways unseen, their power sharper than swords, though carried in whispers softer than breath. Ministers clashed in hidden rooms, not with blades, but with accusations whispered so artfully that no blood needed to be spilled, at least not at first. History remembers the grand spectacles of empires, coronations with trumpets, triumphal marches, and treaties carved in stone. Yet the quieter record, the one not written in monuments but murmured in corridors, often mattered more. When a courtier whispered that a ruler was weak, others began to act as though it were true. When someone dared to hint that the royal treasury had been emptied into private hands, confidence in the state collapsed faster than any army could force it. Whispers, when believed, reshaped reality itself. In ancient courts, where silence could mean safety, and a careless word could mean death, servants became the lifeline of scandal. They carried food to the ruler's table, poured wine into jewelled goblets, dressed the royal body in silks each morning. They saw what others did not see. They overheard what others dared not admit. A passing glance between the queen and a favoured guard, a nighttime visit to a chamber where no visit should have been. A note slipped beneath a golden plate. These things were never written in scrolls or etched into marble, yet they drifted through the palace in hushed fragments, stitched together into truths, or half-truths, that would one day shatter crowns. The most dangerous whispers were often the ones that seemed harmless at first. A jest made at a banquet, suggesting the emperor was more devoted to wine than to war. A casual remark about the beauty of a rival's wife. A suspicion that the treasury's gold weighed less than it once had. Such remarks, once carried from lip to ear, multiplied like echoes in a vast chamber. What began as a murmur became a chorus. Soon the empire itself seemed to hum with scandal, as though its walls could not contain the sound. Whispers had a peculiar way of surviving even when empires did not. Long after the palaces crumbled, the stories remained, carried in chronicles, or in the songs of wandering poets. The great rulers were remembered not only for their victories, but for the secrets that undid them. An emperor undone not by an enemy's sword, but by the rumour of betrayal in his own household. A dynasty that fell not through invasion, but through the whispered suspicion that its bloodline was tainted. History is filled with such endings, and they all began in the same place, in the stillness behind palace walls where silence was never truly silent. Imagine the courtyards at night. Torches flicker. The scent of incense hangs heavy in the air. Somewhere, beyond the echo of footsteps, a pair of figures lean close, voices lowered to barely more than a sigh. Perhaps it is a servant revealing that the empress meets a lover in secret. Perhaps it is a minister warning that the prince is plotting to poison his father. Or perhaps it is only a rumour, invented to wound, passed along because silence is unbearable in places built to contain too much power. It hardly matters. The whisper takes root. It is repeated. And repetition, more than truth, is what grants a scandal its life. Empires were vast, but their rulers were human. And humans, when confronted with whispers, rarely reacted with calm. A single suggestion of betrayal could send emperors spiralling into paranoia. Ministers executed without trial, generals recalled from the front, families torn apart within the palace gates. These reactions only fueled the whispers further, for nothing spreads a scandal more quickly than the attempt to silence it. The act of repression became proof in itself, and the cycle deepened. Behind palace walls, whispers were not only exchanged, they were weaponized. Advisors launched them like arrows, carefully aimed to pierce rivals. Lovers whispered promises that drew rulers away from state affairs. Enemies of the empire, lurking beyond the borders, sometimes found their greatest allies within the palace itself, men and women who carried secrets across forbidden thresholds, letting whispers escape into enemy hands. Thus, long before the public ever learned, long before the streets filled with unrest or the borders collapsed, the fate of empires was often sealed in the private murmurs of their rulers' homes. Great powers crumbled, not in the clang of battle, but in the softest of sounds, the faint stir of breath as secrets moved from one pair of lips to another. The story begins here, in these hidden corridors, where no victory parade ever marched and no historian officially recorded the truth. For it was not armies alone, nor famines, nor plagues, that undid the grandest powers of the past. It was the scandals that were whispered behind palace walls, the scandals that took root in silence and grew until they reached the throne itself. And from these whispers, the unravelling would begin. The hall was vast, its ceilings painted with myths of gods who had long since been forgotten, their faces staring down at tables heavy with roasted meats and goblets of spiced wine. Flickering light from countless torches shimmered against golden plates, sending restless shadows dancing across the stone walls. A banquet was meant to display the wealth of empire, its abundance, its grace, its order. Yet behind the laughter and the clinking of goblets, these gatherings often carried a weight that could not be spoken aloud. For in the very place where power sought to dazzle, secrets found their stage. At the banquet table, the empire displayed itself in miniature. Generals seated near the throne, heavy with armour, though the night required none. Priests robed in silks, their fingers glittering with jewels offered by supplicants who prayed for favour. Ambassadors from distant lands, smiling too carefully, observing more than they revealed. And there, at the centre, the ruler, whether emperor, sultan or king, bathed in light, every gesture scrutinised, every glance interpreted, every word weighed as though it were divine. Banquets, though filled with splendour, were dangerous places. The food, abundant and rich, was not always trusted. Taster slaves ate first, swallowing mouthfuls of venison or figs. Their faces watched with unease for the slightest sign of poison. Goblets were poured and exchanged, but many rulers sipped sparingly, fearful of what invisible hand might lace the wine. Music played, dancers twirled, yet beneath the rhythm of drums and flutes there was always another rhythm, one of sidelong glances, coded gestures, and whispered schemes hidden by laughter. It was here, beneath painted ceilings and perfumed air, that scandals often ripened. A careless touch between a queen and a favoured courtier might be noticed by eyes too sharp for their own good. A drunken boast, overheard by a servant refilling goblets, might become a weapon in the days to come. Wealth itself told stories at these tables. A minister who arrived suddenly draped in gold, heavier than his salary could explain, or a rival who offered gifts so extravagant that loyalty seemed purchased rather than earned. The banquet was not only a celebration, it was an open ledger of power and corruption. The empire's subjects rarely saw these gatherings, but they felt their consequences. The alliances made over roasted pheasant, the jealousies kindled between courses, the scandals born of lingering stares across the table. All of these bled outward into the streets and provinces. Wars began because of words muttered too freely at a banquet. Succession crises flared because a ruler, emboldened by wine, favoured one heir too openly in front of the wrong audience. The fate of thousands could hinge on the tilt of a goblet or the placement of a hand upon another's shoulder. Many dynasties carried stories of banquets that became turning points, though chroniclers often softened the details. They wrote of gifts exchanged, treaties sealed, songs sung until dawn, yet beneath their restrained words lay another truth, that what appeared as merriment often disguised betrayal. One banquet might end with the arrest of half the guests before the morning sun rose. Another might conclude with a sudden illness that spread through the court, whispered to have come from a poisoned dish. And still another might not end at all, for revelry tipped into riot, and the palace gates closed forever upon those who feasted too greedily. The beauty of the banquet was also its danger. In the bright light of ceremony, scandal had no need to hide. It unfolded in plain sight, veiled only by laughter. The ruler's eyes might linger too long on a favoured companion. The courtiers might notice, but they did not speak, at least not there. Later in quiet chambers, the observations grew teeth. What was seen in one night could spiral into accusations, trials, even wars of succession. The banquet table, so heavy with food, bore the weight of empires in ways invisible to those who toasted beneath its glow. The theatre of abundance was never meant for the hungry. Beyond the palace walls, famine might gnaw at the people, yet within the banquet hall, grapes were crushed beneath careless feet as dancers performed, and bread lay uneaten at the edge of silver plates. Such contrasts whispered louder than any jest. Servants carried trays so heavy they bent at the spine, while the nobles they served grew drunk on both wine and power. Every detail told a story. Who was seated close to the ruler? Who was relegated to the edge? Who was absent entirely? Absence, at such gatherings, spoke more loudly than presence. It was not uncommon for banquets to mask purges. Invitations arrived in gilded envelopes, carried with ceremony, promising a night of joy. Guests dressed in their finest, only to discover that the feast was their last. A toast might be raised, music might swell, and at a signal, soldiers entered the hall. The very wine poured in honour became a prelude to chains and execution. And in the silence that followed, the whispers grew stronger than ever, for nothing feeds scandal more hungrily than blood spilled beneath chandeliers. Even in times of peace, these nights left their mark. Songs sung by court musicians carried double meanings. Poets employed by rulers crafted verses that hinted at betrayals they dared not name directly. A jest, spoken with too much sharpness, lingered long after the laughter faded. Some guests left these gatherings trembling, not from drink, but from the realization that they had been seen, that their secret had found eyes in the glittering crowd. Banquets were mirrors, reflecting the empire's strength and its rot in equal measure. The glitter of jewels could not entirely disguise the unease beneath the surface. Every guest knew the truth, though few dared admit it, that the hall's abundance was not eternal, that the empire's wealth was a mask stretched too thin, and that the very people laughing together might in another season be each other's destroyers. And so the nights continued, wine flowing, laughter echoing, shadows lengthening at the edge of candlelight. Scandals, born in whispers, found new life at these gatherings, growing bold in the open, wrapping themselves around the very heart of empire. What was hidden behind walls in silence now took shape in the clatter of goblets and the murmur of conversation drifting across tables. The empire seemed most radiant in these hours, and yet, in that radiance, its unravelling quietly began. For when power gathered to feast, secrets never remained secrets for long, and each banquet carried within it the seeds of decline, planted not in the soil of battlefields, but in the perfumed air above golden plates. Among the glittering tables and the laughter that filled the banquet halls, nothing carried more weight than a cup of wine. A goblet raised to the lips was more than a drink. It was a symbol of trust, of survival, of fragile faith in the loyalty of those who stood nearest to the throne. Yet within that polished metal, danger waited. Few gestures were more natural than to drink, and few were more perilous. The fear of poison haunted the courts of empire like an unseen guest. It was not the clash of swords or the roar of battle that most unnerved rulers at their feasts, but the thought that their end might come in silence, carried on the sweetness of a sip. A poisoned goblet killed with elegance, with swiftness, without the spectacle of rebellion or war. And in palaces that hid endless intrigues, it was a weapon favoured as much as armies or daggers. Wine was the language of celebration, but it was also the language of death. A ruler who lifted a cup did so with the knowledge that trust was the only shield against treachery. No armour could block what was dissolved into the liquid. No guards at the door could protect against what the lips themselves invited. This fear shaped the rituals of the court. Tasters swallowed first, trembling under the gaze of all, their fate deciding whether the ruler would drink. Servants poured carefully, often under watchful eyes, for a hand that lingered too long over the jug might be accused of treason. Yet poison thrived precisely because it was invisible. Unlike swords, It left no witness until it was too late. Unlike armies, it could not be intercepted on the march. It travelled silently through veins, altering the breath, slowing the heart, turning celebration into mourning in a matter of moments. Sometimes death came swiftly, in a collapse before the table. Other times it lingered, disguised as sudden illness, leaving the court unsure whether fate or betrayal had struck. The uncertainty was its true power. Suspicion spread faster than the poison itself, leaving the empire shaken even if the victim survived. Scandal was born not only in the act, but in the doubt that followed. If a ruler faltered after a feast, whispers rushed through the corridors. Was it the venison, too heavily spiced? Was it the figs, brought from distant lands? Or was it the goblet, filled with more than wine? No proof was needed. The doubt itself was enough. A ruler weakened by illness was seen as weakened by enemies. A ruler who trusted the wrong hand became a ruler whose throne swayed beneath him. The poisoned goblet was never merely about death. It was about succession, ambition, desire. Heirs watched their fathers raise cups with a stillness too deliberate. Queens lifted their goblets beside rivals, each sip laced with unspoken challenge. Courtiers toasted one another with smiles that masked years of envy. The drink that warmed the body also chilled the heart, for it reminded every guest that loyalty was always uncertain, and survival always a question. History carried countless stories of such moments, though chroniclers often softened their edges. They recorded the sudden deaths of kings, the unexplained fevers of princes, the mysterious collapses of generals in the midst of feasts. Behind their restrained words lay another truth. The banquet had been more than celebration. It had been a battlefield, its weapons hidden in plain sight. Yet what mattered most was not whether poison had truly been used, but how the court responded to the possibility. A death at the table might lead to purges, entire families executed under suspicion. A fainting spell might bring down ministers, accused of betrayal whether guilty or not. A cough, a fever, a pallor of skin, all became evidence in the court of whispers. And in this way, scandal spread with a speed poison itself could never match. The goblet also revealed something deeper about the empire: the need for tasters, the elaborate rituals of pouring and toasting, the glances exchanged with each sip. These were signs not of strength, but of fragility. A ruler truly secure would not fear his own cup. A dynasty at peace would not suspect every banquet of harbouring death. Yet empires clothed their fear in ceremony, dressing suspicion in gold and silver. The goblet glittered, but the shadow it cast was long. To drink was to surrender, however briefly, to trust. And trust was the rarest commodity in a palace where loyalty could shift with the promise of land or the smile of a rival. The very act of lifting the goblet revealed the paradox of empire. The ruler appeared most powerful when surrounded by abundance. Yet in that moment he was most vulnerable. The poison, if it came, required no armies, no uprisings. It required only a single hand, steady and unseen. And so, in banquet halls where laughter echoed and music swelled, silence always hovered at the rim of every cup. For within the goblet lay the possibility of empire undone, of power slipping away not with the crash of battle, but with the quietest of sips. The scandals that brewed in these moments were never forgotten. They lived on in the stories of servants who swore they saw too much, in the rumours of courtiers who claimed to know who poured the fatal wine, in the sudden disappearances of those accused of treachery. They lingered in the minds of heirs who remembered the trembling of a ruler's hand as the goblet touched his lips. And as the feast continued, as torches burned and tables filled again and again, the shadow of the poisoned goblet never left. It was the uninvited guest at every banquet, the unseen rival at every toast. It whispered of mortality to rulers who believed themselves eternal. It reminded every empire that decline might come, not with armies at the gates, but with the soft clink of a goblet placed upon a table. In the dim corridors of palaces, where tapestries muffled footsteps and torches flickered low, scandal did not always arrive in the form of poisoned cups or whispers of treason. Sometimes it emerged in softer tones, letters hidden beneath pillows, glances stolen across banquet halls, and meetings arranged under cover of night. The empires that projected strength on their battlefields and majesty in their courts were often undone by passions concealed in their own chambers. Love, in such places, was never simply love. A touch of the hand or a sigh in passing was heavy with consequence. To share affection outside the boundaries set by dynasties was to gamble with reputation, power, and sometimes with life itself. A ruler's heart was not truly his own. It belonged to the empire, to the dynasty, to the expectations of lineage. Yet behind veils and locked doors, hearts seldom obeyed the decrees of politics. The scandal of hidden lovers did not always depend on discovery. Rumour alone was enough to tarnish. A queen seen walking too often with a favoured courtier, a noblewoman lingering near the captain of the guard, an emperor's mistress wielding influence in appointments, all became stories traded in whispers. The power of such stories lay not in whether they were true, but in how they shifted trust. A single rumour could persuade ministers that decisions were guided not by reason, but by desire, not by loyalty to the empire, but by loyalty to a secret companion. History has shown that lovers in the shadows rarely stayed hidden for long. Letters were intercepted, jewellery misplaced, servants bribed. A candle burned too late in the night became evidence. The presence of perfume in the wrong chamber became proof. And when such secrets reached the ears of courtiers already eager for scandal, they grew into weapons sharper than any blade. Rivals did not need to expose truth. Suggestion alone was sufficient to fracture an empire's dignity. What made these scandals so corrosive was not only the act itself, but the imbalance they revealed. If a ruler's choices could be swayed by affection, then governance was no longer about the empire, but about private desire. Treaties might be signed to please a lover. Armies might be moved to impress a companion. Treasuries might be emptied on gifts, not campaigns. The empire's vast machinery became vulnerable to the most fragile of human impulses. Yet love also carried danger beyond the political. The secrecy required to protect it bred networks of confidence and accomplices. Servants smuggled notes, guards turned blind eyes, ministers traded silence for favours. With every link in that chain, the empire's stability weakened. For if a lover could compel silence or loyalty in one corner of the court, who could say what else might be hidden in those same shadows? Some lovers were quiet, content to exist unseen, shaping little beyond the intimacy they shared. Others reached further, using affection as a means to power. A whisper in a ruler's ear at night could be echoed in a decree by morning. A moment of jealousy could shift the balance of noble families. Enemies were exiled, allies were promoted, and nations trembled, all because of secrets guarded by candlelight. The tragedy of it all was how ordinary these scandals could seem in private. Two people longing for each other, seeking comfort in a life hemmed by duty and expectation, created storms they could not always foresee. What for them was escape became, for the empire, a fracture line. The smallest tenderness risked becoming history's turning point, and so the court watched. Every gesture, every pause, every smile was catalogued. Banquets became theatre stages. and corridors became hunting grounds for evidence. The shadow of lovers haunted the Empire's image, whether or not the lovers themselves were ever exposed. Even suspicion left a mark. The Empire's strength, once measured in armies and wealth, was slowly judged instead by the faithfulness of its rulers' hearts. Over time, these private scandals grew louder than victories in battle. Chroniclers, cautious yet curious, wrote cautiously of favoritism or influence. Pamphlets and gossip carried stories into the streets, where ordinary people debated the morality of those who ruled them. Scandal travelled further than armies ever could. It seeped into taverns, markets and households, eroding reverence for the throne. In the end, lovers in the shadows left scars deeper than betrayal. They blurred the line between ruler and ruled, private and public, heart and state. They revealed how fragile empires truly were, not because of enemies at their borders, but because of desires that bloomed within their own palaces. For when an empire's fate rests on hidden meetings and silent vows, collapse does not require armies. It requires only a kiss behind a curtain, a secret exchanged by candlelight, a promise whispered where no one was meant to hear. And as the night deepened, the palace held its breath, knowing that scandal did not sleep. It lingered in the footsteps fading down darkened halls, waiting for the moment when shadows would become stories, and stories would become the ruin of empires. Palaces had always been built on loyalty, but loyalty was a currency that rarely kept its value. Gold could purchase it for a season, promises could hold it for a while longer, and fear could force it into silence. Yet none of these could guarantee permanence. The deeper an empire sank into scandal, the more fragile loyalty became, until betrayal was not the exception, but the inevitable cost of survival. Betrayal seldom arrived with grand declarations. It slipped quietly into the cracks of trust. A minister who once swore eternal devotion to the throne found it more convenient to share secrets with a rival faction. A soldier tasked with defending the palace at dawn might instead open the gates in the middle of the night. A confidant entrusted with letters of affection could decide that their value was worth more in another hand. In these choices, empires began to bleed, not from swords or arrows, but from the steady loss of trust. What made betrayal so corrosive was that it could never be contained. Once suspicion took root, it spread through every corridor, through every council, through every chamber where power was whispered about in shadows. The emperor looked at his generals and wondered which had already sold him. Queens questioned their ladies in waiting, fearing that every smile concealed a hidden bargain. Even the humblest servant might become dangerous, for betrayal was not a privilege of the powerful. It was a weapon available to anyone who desired safety, revenge, or gain. The price of betrayal was not only the collapse of trust, but also the cost it demanded in retribution. When betrayal was uncovered, punishment became theatre. Executions were staged in public squares, not only to end a traitor's life, but to remind the watching crowd of the consequences of treachery. Heads on spikes, bodies displayed at city gates, names struck from records, all served to warn others. Yet the cruelty of such punishments rarely restored loyalty. Instead, it revealed the ruler's fear. A throne secured by executions was a throne already trembling. The most dangerous betrayals came not from enemies, but from companions. An invading army was a visible foe, one that could be fought with walls and weapons. But a trusted counsellor who turned away at the crucial hour was far more destructive. Such betrayal pierced deeper because it carried knowledge, secrets of supply routes, weaknesses of defences, the private fears of rulers. To be betrayed by a friend was to hand the enemy the keys to the kingdom, wrapped in the language of familiarity and trust. Scandal magnified betrayal. For once, rulers were accused of weakness, corruption, or hidden lovers. Their companions measured loyalty differently. Why tie oneself to a faltering empire when a rival might soon rise in its place? Betrayal became less about ambition and more about survival. In such climates, remaining loyal was not seen as virtuous, but as reckless. When betrayal became common sense, the empire was already unravelling. Stories linger of generals who betrayed their armies for promises of gold, of queens who conspired against kings for the sake of secret loves, of ministers who traded alliances with every shift of fortune. Each act carried its own immediate gain, land, wealth, influence, but the long-term price was always greater. Betrayal planted seeds of mistrust that outlived both the traitor and the betrayed. Once faith was broken, it could not be restored. The cracks remained in the foundation of empire, widening with each new act of disloyalty. But betrayal had its subtler costs too. A ruler surrounded by traitors, or even by the fear of traitors, ruled differently. Orders became harsher, decrees more suspicious, punishments more severe. Councils dissolved into silence, for no one dared to speak freely in a room where every word might be sold outside the door. Governance slowed, then faltered, until decisions were made not for the empire, but for the ruler's paranoia. Betrayal transformed palaces into prisons, where rulers locked themselves away behind walls, certain that every ally was an enemy in waiting. Even when betrayal was punished swiftly, its echo remained. The people whispered of it in markets, telling each other that loyalty meant little in their empire. Soldiers discussed it in barracks, questioning whether their commanders might betray them as easily as they betrayed kings. Merchants calculated whether investing in the empire's markets was wise if rulers and nobles could no longer trust one another. The story of betrayal outlived the event itself, reshaping the way subjects saw their rulers. Some betrayals became legendary, their very names symbols of treachery. Others were smaller, quieter, known only in the dark corners of the palace. Yet each one carried a price beyond its immediate act. Every betrayal weakened the fabric of empire, making it less a monument of stone and more a fragile weave of secrets, lies, and shifting allegiances. In time, the empire's mightiest walls could be toppled not by siege engines, but by the simple act of trust undone. The empire learned, too late, that betrayal was not only about those who turned away, but also about what drove them to it. Broken promises, greed left unchecked, love made dangerous, fear cultivated by scandal, these were the roots. To punish the act was simple. To prevent its cause was nearly impossible. For as long as rulers were human, desire, ambition, and resentment ensured that betrayal would never vanish. It would wait quietly in the shadows, its price demanded again and again, until the empire itself could no longer afford to pay. And so, within palaces where marble columns once gleamed, betrayal became the true architecture, unseen yet unshakable, shaping every choice, every glance, every silence. Its cost was not measured in coin, but in the slow unravelling of trust. And once that trust was gone, no empire could endure for long. Betrayal was rarely born in silence. More often, it was purchased. Gold, heavier than loyalty, spoke with a voice that even the most solemn oaths could not silence. For all the ceremonies of empire, with crowns placed upon heads and banners draped across halls, power was often reduced to the clink of coins sliding into open hands. Treasuries were meant to sustain armies, to build aqueducts, to maintain temples and roads. But in courts unravelling under scandal, those coins drifted elsewhere. They bought silence where questions should have been raised, purchased allies when trust no longer held, and secured the services of spies who slipped easily between rival chambers. It was said that a well-placed purse of gold could do more to sway a battle than 10,000 soldiers. And in palaces where faith had crumbled, gold became the true sovereign. Those who served rulers learned quickly where power resided. A soldier might be loyal to his commander until a rival offered double his pay. A priest might guard the sanctity of the temple until promised a golden chalice for his compliance. Even the humblest servant could be tempted to unlock a door, to carry a letter, to repeat a careless word. Gold turned shadows into allies, and those allies into threats. Scandals deepened this dependency. A ruler desperate to preserve dignity would spend lavishly, bribing courtiers into silence, or buying favour with costly gifts. The jewels bestowed upon a lover, the estates granted to a confidant, the sacks of coins delivered to generals were not acts of generosity, but payments in a marketplace of trust. Once these transactions began, they could never end. The empire grew addicted to buying its own survival. Yet the weight of such spending carried its own doom. Treasuries emptied, not because wars were lost, but because loyalty was too expensive to maintain. Gold flowed out faster than it could be brought in, and when coffers ran dry, the empire stood exposed. A ruler who had secured obedience with coin found only silence when the purses grew light. Soldiers muttered of unpaid wages, merchants hesitated to lend, and courtiers drifted toward whichever faction still had wealth to offer. The irony was bitter. Gold, meant to protect thrones, corroded them. For every coin spent in secrecy, another voice was silenced, another truth suppressed. Over time, no one believed in the throne itself. They believed only in the rewards it could dispense. The crown's authority was no longer sacred, but negotiable, no longer respected, but rented. Even enemies beyond the empire's borders understood this weakness. They learned that bribing a guard could prove more effective than storming a fortress, that purchasing the loyalty of a minister could do more than a siege. Empires that once terrified their neighbours with armies now inspired calculation. How cheaply might their strength be bought? The tragedy of gold was that it promised certainty while sowing collapse. Rulers who trusted in wealth to solve their scandals discovered that coin could never restore faith. Once people saw that obedience was bought, the illusion of unity shattered. Every noble demanded more. Every soldier bargained harder. Every servant knew their silence had value. The empire became a marketplace where survival was auctioned daily. And when at last the gold was gone, the silence was broken. Those who had taken coin for loyalty spoke freely, exposing secrets in the open squares. Enemies revealed themselves as former friends, and the scandals that gold had once concealed now returned, sharper and more destructive than before. In the end, crowns were no heavier than the purses that sustained them, and when those purses emptied, thrones stood defenceless. Thus the empire learned that betrayal had a price, but loyalty did too, and when both were paid in gold, the weight of coins became heavier than the crown itself. When treasuries were strained and loyalty reduced to the weight of coin, rulers turned to spectacle. Grand feasts filled the night with music and laughter, as though the echoes of scandal could be drowned beneath the sound of drums and flutes. Banquets stretched into dawn, their tables groaning under roasted meats, spiced wines, and towers of sugared fruit. Yet the true purpose of these gatherings was rarely nourishment. They were theatres of distraction, carefully staged performances, where appearances mattered more than truth. Masks, both literal and unseen, became the evening's essential attire. Nobles arrived veiled in silk or adorned with painted disguises, but their true concealment lay in smiles practiced to hide envy, bows designed to cloak ambition, and compliments sharpened like daggers. A midnight feast was not merely a celebration. It was an arena where alliances shifted with every glance, and where whispered conversations in shadowed alcoves could alter the fate of dynasties. These gatherings carried their own dangers, for in such excess, secrets found new ways to slip free. A drunken noble too bold with his words might reveal what had been carefully hidden in daylight. A jealous glance between companions could confirm suspicions more powerfully than rumour ever could. Servants moved silently among the tables, hearing more than they were meant to, and carrying those fragments into the city long after the torches had burned out. The Mask of Abundance also revealed the Empire's weakness. Citizens outside the palace walls, hungry and weary from taxation, saw no joy in these spectacles. The same gold that might have secured bread or strengthened defences was instead poured into wine cups and entertainment. Murmurs spread through the markets that rulers feasted while their subjects starved, that masks concealed not mystery but shame. The Empire's grandeur, once a symbol of pride, became proof of its indifference. Yet inside the halls, the danger was subtler. Behind the glitter of chandeliers and the scent of roses scattered on the floors, rivalries sharpened. Every toast was measured for its sincerity, every dance observed for hidden meanings. Lovers met behind curtains, conspirators exchanged coded phrases, and ministers weighed their loyalties against the opportunities seated across the table. A feast was never only a feast. It was a negotiation, a gamble, a performance where each participant played a role. Rulers themselves were not exempt from these games. To preside over such feasts was to walk a tightrope between generosity and suspicion. Too much favour shown to one guest could alienate others. Too sharp a glance could expose hidden fears. Even the act of raising a goblet carried meaning, for those who watched carefully read signs into every movement. In halls filled with masks, sincerity became impossible to recognise. The irony was that these spectacles, designed to conceal scandal, often became their birthplace. Excess invited gossip. The lavish gifts exchanged at the feasts drew questions about how they were paid for. The favoured seats at the ruler's side hinted at secret influences. A stumble in dance, a slip of the tongue, a smile held too long, each became the seed of rumour that would grow unchecked by morning. By trying to hide behind laughter and luxury, rulers often revealed more than they concealed. The midnight feast, cloaked in music and masquerade, was therefore a dangerous stage. It promised joy, but delivered vulnerability. When masks were worn too long, they clung even when dawn broke. Nobles returned to their estates not with unity, but with sharpened suspicion, whispering of what they thought they had seen behind the disguises. And in the silence after the music faded, the Empire was left weaker, not stronger. For scandal thrived in such places. It needed no proof, only suggestion. A glance here, a laugh there, a conversation overheard through layers of music. The mask did not truly protect, it only invited others to imagine what might lie beneath. An imagination, once sparked, was far more destructive than truth. In time, the midnight feast became less a celebration and more a symbol. It marked the moment when rulers, desperate to preserve dignity, offered illusion instead of stability. The Empire survived on appearances, its masks gleaming brighter than its foundations, its laughter louder than its strength. Yet every mask eventually slipped, and when it did, the truth that emerged was far more dangerous than what had been concealed. Thus, as dawn crept through the palace windows, the torches sputtered, and the guests departed, leaving behind fragments of silk, spilled wine, and whispered stories. The feast was over, but the scandal it birthed lingered. In the silence of morning, masks lay discarded on the floor, reminders that beneath the glitter, the empire itself was already beginning to fracture. Amid the glow of feasts and the glitter of courtly masks, another figure lingered in the background of the empire's story, a figure who carried no jewelled crown and wore no silk veil, but whose presence was more unsettling than either. Generals, unlike courtiers, were not confined to palaces. They walked both the marble halls and the muddy fields, their hands familiar with both the pen that signed decrees and the sword that carried them out. They commanded armies, but more dangerously, they commanded knowledge. And knowledge, in a time of scandal, could unravel more than any army ever could. A general knew what rulers preferred hidden. He knew how many soldiers were truly loyal, how many had gone unpaid, and how many had sworn allegiance only as long as coin flowed. He knew which provinces seethed in resentment, which fortresses stood hollow, and which borders were more fragile than the empire admitted. These truths were rarely spoken aloud in gilded halls, for rulers thrived on illusion. Yet to the general, illusions were meaningless. He had seen men desert at midnight, watched supplies vanish in corrupt hands, and heard soldiers grumble of betrayal. No mask at a feast could obscure such realities. The danger lay not only in what he knew, but in how others believed he might use it. A ruler who owed victories to such a man could never fully rest in his presence. Gratitude, in the tense air of empire, quickly curdled into fear. For if a general commanded the loyalty of thousands, what was to stop him from turning those thousands against the very throne he was sworn to protect? Scandals sharpened this fear. When whispers of lovers, bribes, and feasts echoed through the streets, subjects began to look past the palace walls toward those who seemed untainted. The general, hardened by campaigns and far from the perfumes of the court, appeared to some as a figure of honesty, or at least of necessity. His voice, calm and seasoned by war, carried weight when rulers stumbled in distraction. Even a hint of disapproval from him could ignite doubts among nobles already restless. But generals were rarely content with silence. To hold such knowledge was to carry a weapon heavier than a sword. Some wielded it discreetly, pressing rulers into granting lands, titles, or wealth in exchange for continued loyalty. Others let their discontent slip in guarded tones, reminding courtiers that armies are marched at their command. The most dangerous did nothing at all, simply standing in quiet watchfulness, their silence interpreted as looming threat. Rulers, uncertain of how to contain this, often chose poorly. Some drowned their generals in rewards, hoping excess would blunt ambition. Others turned to suspicion, surrounding them with spies, intercepting letters, and spreading rumours to diminish their honour. But each attempt only revealed the ruler's fear, and fear was the one weakness no throne could conceal. History remembers those generals who stepped too far, who allowed knowledge to become open defiance. Some were met with swift execution, their loyalty questioned one time too many. Others were elevated beyond measure, their armies carrying them into power when crowns faltered. In every case, the scandal was the same. The ruler had allowed another to hold the empire's secrets, and secrets, once known, could never be unlearned. The general who knew too much was more than a threat to the throne. He was a mirror of its fragility. His presence revealed how little of the empire's power rested on ritual, and how much depended on the men who fought, marched, and bled in silence. The ruler could claim divine favour, could adorn himself in jewels and robes, but when the soldiers shifted their eyes toward their commander rather than their crown, the true centre of power was exposed. In this tension, trust became impossible. Councils filled with guarded glances when the general entered the room. Courtiers whispered of what he might say, what he might know, what he might demand. At feasts, the ruler raised his cup with forced cheer, while his eyes flickered toward the soldier seated at his side, calculating the weight of loyalty against the danger of knowledge. And yet, the general's danger was not always of his own making. Often he did not need to betray, or even to speak. The court betrayed itself by fearing him, by imagining ambitions where perhaps none existed. In that fear, ministers plotted, nobles schemed, and rulers struck first, turning suspicion into action. Some generals died never having lifted a hand against their sovereign, executed only for what they knew, or for what others believed they might one day attempt. But whether real or imagined, the threat lingered. Knowledge was a shadow that could not be dismissed, and generals carried shadows longer than any other. In times of scandal, when the throne's dignity cracked beneath rumour, the shadow of a general stretched across the empire, a silent reminder that crowns were fragile things, and that truth, once seen, was more dangerous than any lie. Thus the empire lived uneasily, torn between rulers who wore crowns of gold and generals who carried knowledge like steel. And as whispers multiplied in the corners of the palace, one question grew sharper. Who truly held the empire in their hands? The one seated on the throne, or the one who knew too much? The figure of the general cast its shadow wide, but within the palace walls another presence stirred unease, quieter, yet no less dangerous. Rivalries at court did not always march with swords or whisper with conspirators. Sometimes they bloomed in silence, in glances unspoken and gestures carefully withheld. Among these, few rivalries cut deeper than those surrounding the queen, whose place in the empire was both exalted and precarious. A queen's power was delicate. It did not rest upon armies or decrees, but upon perception, her grace, her alliances, her ability to embody dignity in a world restless with rumour. Yet the palace was rarely kind to such figures. Every smile she gave was measured, every word dissected, every act of generosity interpreted for hidden meaning. It was inevitable that others, whether noble women at court or mistresses with influence of their own, would rise as silent rivals, threatening her place not with open defiance, but with subtler weapons. The rival's strength often lay in invisibility. She could be a lady-in-waiting who lingered too long in the king's presence, a companion whose laughter filled chambers where the queen's voice fell still, or even a shadow of memory, an earlier lover, a bond never quite broken. Whether real or imagined, the rival existed in the queen's daily silence, and silence was the most corrosive of all poisons. Courtiers noticed the smallest changes. If the queen's expression stiffened at a name, if her greetings carried the faintest hesitation, whispers began to stir. They did not need evidence of betrayal. The possibility was enough. Soon the court spoke of factions, of loyalties divided, of influence slipping quietly from the queen's hand. The empire itself, already weighed down by a scandal, found another fracture line. What made such rivalries destructive was not their intimacy alone, but the politics that clung to them. A queen who feared being overshadowed often drew her allies tighter, rewarding some families with favour while excluding others. A rival, in turn, might draw strength from those cast aside, forming her own circle of support. What began as a private contest soon reshaped the entire court, each gesture of affection or dismissal sending ripples through the empire's fragile balance. The king, caught between them, rarely controlled the storm. To favour the queen risked seeming blind to her flaws. To favour the rival risked undermining the throne's dignity. His silence, his hesitation, his attempts at balance, all became fuel for gossip. Ministers debated which woman truly guided the ruler's choices, while the people in the streets, hungry for scandal, traded stories of jealousies and betrayals. Yet the greatest danger of a queen's silent rival was not in the rivalry itself, but in the secrets it drew into the open. Letters written in haste, gifts exchanged under cover of night, servants sworn to secrecy, all became part of a fragile web that could collapse with the faintest pull. And once the web collapsed, the scandal was no longer whispered but proclaimed, transforming silent tension into public spectacle. Some queens endured such rivals with composure, concealing their bitterness behind the same calm smiles that had once earned their position. Others fought openly, banishing companions, dismissing ladies in waiting, demanding oaths of loyalty. Yet in both paths, the cost was the same. The empire saw its queen not as a figure of unity, but as a woman consumed by the same jealousies and suspicions that plagued common households. Reverence waned, and with it, the aura of power that cloaked the throne. In truth, the rival rarely needed to win. Her very existence, her very silence, was victory enough. By unsettling the queen, by forcing her into displays of fear or anger, she revealed to the world how fragile the empire's image had become. In the end, scandal did not require betrayal. It required only the suggestion that betrayal was possible. And so, the court moved uneasily, watching two figures whose rivalry shaped decisions far beyond their chambers. Ministers weighed their words, nobles measured their allegiances, and the empire itself trembled beneath the weight of a contest waged not with armies but with glances in candlelit halls. The queen stood, adorned in jewels that gleamed like armour, yet even as she shone, the shadow of her silent rival lengthened. And in that shadow, scandal grew, patient and inevitable, waiting for the moment when silence would at last give way to ruin. In a palace already unsettled by silent rivalries and hidden suspicions, words themselves became weapons sharper than any blade. Rumours did not march through gates or break down walls. They slipped under doors, whispered from servant to servant, drifting upward through corridors until they reached the gilded chambers where rulers sat uneasy. Unlike soldiers, rumours could not be dismissed with pay. Unlike generals, they could not be bound by loyalty. They multiplied in silence, each telling birthing another, until the air of empire itself grew heavy with them. What made these whispers unbearable was not their lack of truth, but their persistence. A lie might be denied, but denial itself gave it shape. A rumour might be foolish, but once spoken, it could never be fully unsaid. A ruler, no matter how powerful, lived in the shadow of what people chose to believe, and in times of scandal, belief was never kind. Courts treated rumours as matters of life and death, for they often were. Ministers convened not to discuss law or taxes, but to weigh whether the latest whisper carried danger. Was the Queen truly betrayed? Had the treasury been emptied by bribes? Did the general prepare secret letters to win soldiers' favour? Each rumour carried the same weight as fact, for in the eyes of the people and the nobility, appearance mattered more than truth. Thus began the trial of rumours. It was never announced as such, yet the palace lived within its courtroom. Evidence mattered little. What counted were perceptions. Who spoke first? Who spoke loudest? Who spoke last? Accusations were paraded as certainties, and silence itself was treated as confession. A ruler accused of weakness was weakened already, for even denying the charge showed he had been touched by it. The machinery of empire, once devoted to governance, twisted itself around these unseen trials. Spies multiplied, not to track armies or borders, but to catch fragments of speech at feasts. Letters were intercepted not for strategy, but for careless phrases. Servants, once invisible, found their whispers prized above coin, in such a world, loyalty itself dissolved, for even the most trusted could be tempted to speak a word too many. The greatest cruelty of rumours lay in their shapelessness. They could not be confronted directly, for they had no face. One day they claimed the ruler squandered wealth, the next that he hid illness, another that his closest allies plotted betrayal. Each was different, yet all together painted a portrait of decline. To fight them was to strike at shadows, to grow weary while the whispers only spread. Rulers tried many defences. Some silenced voices with harsh decrees, punishing those who dared repeat certain words. Yet this only confirmed the rumours in the eyes of the people. For why silence what was harmless? Others drowned whispers in grand displays, parades, feasts, monuments, hoping to overwhelm doubt with spectacle. But spectacles faded, and rumours endured. The wisest tried to ignore them, letting silence smother noise, but silence too was dangerous, for it left space for imagination, and imagination proved the most creative storyteller of all. The trial of rumours was not confined to palaces. It echoed in markets, in taverns, in quiet streets at dusk. A farmer who believed the treasury had been emptied grew reluctant to pay his tax. A soldier who heard his general plotted rebellion began to weigh his loyalty. A merchant who suspected the queen was shamed began to fear the coin stamped with the empire's crest. Thus, rumours did not merely embarrass rulers, they weakened the foundations on which their power stood. What began as whispers of scandal could end in rebellion. People who believed their empire crumbled no longer stood firm to defend it. Nobles who thought their ruler compromised began to dream of new leaders. Generals, sensing unrest, weighed whether silence or action served them better. And all the while, the empire, mighty in arms and monuments, grew fragile in belief. History remembers these trials not in verdicts, but in outcomes. Some rulers emerged seemingly untouched, though beneath the surface, their power was already eroded. Others fell swiftly, abandoned by allies who feared being tainted by association. In each case, the rumours did not merely tell stories, they became the story. And when the dust settled, what remained of empire was not a monument to truth, but a caution of how swiftly whispers can topple crowns. No law could ever truly contain them. No sword could ever cut them down. They thrived because people needed them, because scandal gave shape to their discontent and voice to their doubts. A throne could silence opposition with force, but it could never silence the need to speak. And in that need lay the most enduring weapon of all. The palace, for all its marble and ceremony, was not made of stone, but of words. And when words turned against it, no empire could stand unshaken. Thus the trial of rumours, endless and unseen, judged every ruler alike, condemning not through evidence, but through belief, and delivering sentences more permanent than any court of law. Gold has always glimmered brighter in the dim corridors of empire than any jewel or crown. It was the promise of wealth, the engine of armies, the law that bound distant provinces to the heart of a capital. Yet when scandal touched gold, its glow turned dark. A coin, once symbol of power, could become a mark of betrayal, a token not of prosperity, but of corruption. And in those moments, empires discovered that blood and money were never far apart. Within the palace, treasuries overflowed with stamped currency, each coin carrying the face of a ruler meant to endure across time. But the weight of metal was rarely enough to guarantee loyalty. Greed sharpened where ambition smouldered, and it was not uncommon to see coffers drained not by war or famine, but by hands too eager to take what was not theirs. Ministers grew rich from hidden bribes. Courtiers purchased favour, as though authority were a market stall. Even the soldiers, those sworn to uphold the empire's dignity, found themselves bartering honour for silver slipped quietly into their palms. When such corruption bled outward, it left marks no monument could disguise. Roads remained unfinished, for funds meant for stone had vanished. Armies went unpaid, and their loyalty wavered. The people, who bore the burden of taxation, whispered bitterly as they clutched coins that no longer fed their children, but lined the purses of men in power. The empire did not crumble all at once. It rotted slowly, from within, as if its very veins had been poisoned with counterfeit trust. The scandals tied to coin were rarely hidden for long. Silver leaves trails, and trails invite discovery. Merchants noticed when noble families suddenly grew wealthier than their estates allowed. Soldiers grumbled when new palaces rose while their wages disappeared. And soon, as always, rumours gave way to accusations, each coin itself becoming evidence of betrayal. To possess wealth in such times was not merely to be fortunate, it was to be suspect. What gave these scandals their true force was the violence that followed them. For stolen coin did not merely shift from one hand to another, it demanded silence. Assassinations were arranged with the very money that had been stolen. Guards bribed with silver to look away as throats were cut in shadowed courtyards. Rivals were poisoned not out of hatred, but out of fear they might speak too freely. Thus each coin carried not only the ruler's image, but the echo of lives extinguished for its sake. Blood clung to gold most visibly when loyalty itself was purchased. Generals who might have defended a throne could be swayed by the promise of a chest of coin larger than their annual stipend. Provinces, weary of broken promises, welcomed invaders whose purses seemed heavier. And when rulers sought to secure their survival with desperate payments, their gifts often only hastened decline. For those who accept bribes are rarely bound by gratitude. They are bound by greed, and greed is never satisfied. The streets of empire, once proud avenues, began to tell this story. Taverns filled with men who spoke of unpaid service, of wealth hoarded by a few while the many starved. Markets grew restless as inflation turned silver worthless, each coin losing value as more were minted to cover debts that could not be repaid. And above it all, the palace gleamed with unnatural splendour, each gilded wall a reminder that corruption could not be hidden behind beauty forever. History is heavy with moments where blood stained coin. In some realms, conspirators were discovered counting their ill-gotten treasure only to be struck down by assassins sent by their former allies. In others, rulers themselves paid with their lives, slain not by foreign invaders, but by the very guards whose loyalty had been bought and resold too many times. It was not steel alone that ended dynasties, but the simple realization that coin was worth more than crowns. What is most haunting is how ordinary these scandals appeared before they erupted into ruin. At first, they were merely whispers of missing sums, of gifts exchanged too freely, of noblemen growing fat while the people grew lean. But like rust, what seemed minor spread until the structure itself collapsed. By the time the ruler acted, it was too late. The coins, once a promise of empire, had become proof of its betrayal. Blood has a way of leaving stains long after the hands that spilled it are gone. Coins recovered from such times often show their wear, not only from trade, but from the memory of the lives they purchased, the silences they demanded, the betrayals they sealed. Empires may rise again, but the scars of corruption linger, reminders that the cost of scandal is never measured only in wealth lost, but in the lives extinguished to protect it. In the end, coins stained with blood became relics not of prosperity but of decline. They whispered of an empire that sold its soul for fleeting gain, that traded honour for silver, and that discovered too late that wealth built on betrayal cannot endure. For while gold glitters in the moment, blood darkens forever, and it is blood, not gold, that history remembers. For all the riches of an empire, for all the power etched into crowns and carved into marble, there remained a truth that palaces could never fully conceal: rulers were human. Beneath the gilded robes and guarded gates, behind the walls that separated sovereigns from their subjects, lay frailties no decree could silence. And when scandal had already corroded trust, even the smallest hint of weakness at the heart of rule became more dangerous than any invading army. The emperor, outwardly radiant in ceremony, carried a wound that no one dared name aloud. It was not always a wound of flesh, though illness, injury, and age all played their roles in history's stories, but a wound of perception, the suspicion that the figure upon the throne was not invincible. Once such suspicion crept into the air, it lingered like smoke. Ministers studied his gait, courtiers weighed his silences, generals measured whether his commands carried the same force they once did. A cough during a procession could echo louder than a trumpet. A moment of hesitation when raising a goblet might be repeated in whispers until it grew into a tale of poisoning. Even the ruler's attempts to conceal his frailty often fed the rumours further. Curtains drawn longer than usual, audiences postponed without reason, sudden absences from the public eye. All became proof to the watching court that something was hidden, something festering beneath the surface of authority. The empire lived not by armies alone, but by faith in the strength of its ruler. That faith, once fractured, spread unease like a slow contagion. Nobles speculated about succession with increasing boldness. Rival claimants sharpened their ambitions, each convinced that a faltering emperor was opportunity's signal. Foreign envoys, sensing weakness, wrote back to their own rulers with thinly veiled delight, reporting that the empire's heart had grown fragile. The unseen wound did more than weaken the throne, it drew scavengers. Physicians were summoned, each promising miraculous cures, their loyalty as uncertain as their methods. Some offered potions that soothed pain, but clouded the mind, leaving the emperor drowsy while ministers quietly assumed his authority. Others used the opportunity to press their influence, whispering advice to a ruler too weary to resist, binding policy not to reason, but to the hands that held the medicine. The palace, once a fortress of order, became a theatre of uncertainty. Every glance toward the emperor's face sought confirmation of decline. Every decision he made was scrutinized for signs of diminished clarity. And when decisions faltered, as all decisions in times of scandal eventually did, those watching nodded knowingly, convinced that the wound had spread beyond the body into the empire itself. It is in these moments that history shows the cruelty of perception. An emperor might still be capable, still sharp of mind and steady of will, yet the mere belief that he was weakened was enough to unravel authority. Soldiers hesitated to obey commands. Nobles held back their allegiance. Rivals, real and imagined, began to gather strength. The throne, though still occupied, grew hollow, as if the figure seated upon it was already a ghost. The scandals tied to such wounds were never spoken of openly. No one announced that the emperor's strength had faded. Instead, it emerged through subtle changes, the signatures written shakier on decrees, the public appearances rarer, the once firm voice softening under the strain of age or pain. Each of these signs became a kind of silent testimony, convincing the empire that its ruler's days of command were numbered. And yet, the unseen wound did not only scar the ruler, it scarred the realm. Decisions delayed meant justice postponed. Suspicion slowed trade, for merchants feared the stability of the crown. Armies lingered idle, waiting for orders that came too late or not at all. In such gaps, discontent thrived. Scandals that had once seemed small, coins missing from treasuries, whispers of betrayal in court, now grew monstrous, for without a strong hand to restrain them, they multiplied unchecked. There is a kind of inevitability in these stories. Empires rarely collapse at the height of strength. They falter when the hand that guides them trembles, whether from wound, illness, or exhaustion. And because wounds of the flesh are often hidden, the greater danger lies in what people imagine. A scratch could be spoken of as mortal. A passing fever could be painted as the shadow of death. And once people believed their ruler had grown weak, they behaved as if weakness were already fact. The emperor's unseen wound, then, was less a secret of the body, and more a mirror of the empire itself. His silence reflected its doubts. His weakness embodied its decline. As he struggled unseen in the privacy of chambers, the empire writhed in uncertainty. Each rumour, each hesitation, each betrayal, made heavier by the belief that the heart of power no longer beat as it once had. And so history remembers him not by the victories he had won in youth, nor by the wealth once poured into his coffers, but by the shadow of his decline. A ruler undone not by armies, not by famine, not even by the betrayal of allies, but by the wound no one could see, and everyone chose to believe. The empire's fall was written not in blood upon the battlefield, but in whispers carried on the air of court, whispers that said the emperor, though crowned and cloaked, was already fading. Power, once questioned, rarely returns to its former brightness. The throne, which had stood as the unshakable heart of empire, now seemed less a seat of command, and more a stage where uncertainty played its endless performance. The emperor, carrying wounds both seen and unseen, found himself surrounded not only by courtiers and generals, but by shadows, silent presences that gathered in corners, whispering, calculating, waiting. These shadows were not of walls or fading candlelight. They were people, ambitions cloaked in loyalty, figures who bowed in public, but measured in secret how long the crown might still rest where it did. Ministers sharpened their smiles, noble families positioned their heirs more visibly at feasts, and foreign ambassadors leaned closer, pressing gifts upon those they suspected would soon inherit authority. The throne was no longer seen as eternal. It was seen as vulnerable, and vulnerability drew rivals like moths to a dimming flame. The atmosphere within the palace thickened. Conversations grew shorter, filled with careful pauses. Every silence concealed calculations. To sit in council was no longer to govern, but to perform endurance. Each man waiting to see whether the emperor's hand trembled as it lifted the stylus, whether his words trailed into uncertainty before a decree was sealed. These observations carried more weight than the decrees themselves. In a world shaped by perception, the appearance of decline was a prophecy of collapse. It was in this atmosphere that scandal grew most easily. For when the throne seemed weak, every betrayal felt safer. Coin changed hands with greater boldness. Alliances were sworn with less pretense of secrecy. Rumours were spoken not in whispers, but in half smiles, as if everyone already agreed the empire's future was shifting. What had once been hidden in corners now walked openly in the corridors of power. The throne itself seemed haunted. The very chamber where rulers once declared victories now echoed with doubt. The great canopy above, embroidered with symbols of strength, cast long shadows that seemed to mock the fragility beneath. Courtiers stepped carefully when summoned, not out of reverence, but out of fear. Fear of being tied to a failing ruler. Fear of being noticed by those already preparing for what came next. And still the emperor sat, adorned in the full regalia of office, but diminished by the unseen weight pressing upon him. The crown glittered as it always had, yet it seemed heavier. its brightness unable to drive away the gloom that settled deeper each day. His authority no longer flowed outward with ease. It was contested by hesitation, by the ambitions of others, by the silent understanding that the empire no longer believed as it once had. The most dangerous of these shadows were those who moved closest. Trusted advisors began to carve their own paths, guiding decisions not toward stability, but toward their private gain. Generals stationed at the borders delayed their reports, testing whether obedience could be stretched. Even family members, princes, brothers, nephews, watched with careful eyes, weighing whether loyalty or ambition promised them more. The empire no longer stood behind one throne, it leaned toward whichever figure seemed strongest in the fading light. History shows that such moments often passed without a single blow, yet they marked the beginning of true collapse. No invasion had yet broken the gates, no rebellion had yet swept through the streets, and still the empire was unravelling. For the greatest threat was not outside, it was inside, in the shifting allegiances, in the silence that grew after the emperor's words, in the sense that the crown no longer commanded, but merely endured. The scandal of weakness was sharper than any tale of treachery or stolen coin. A ruler exposed as human, fragile, faltering, broke the spell that had bound subjects together. Without that spell, every scandal multiplied in weight. Whispers of betrayal were believed more quickly. Stories of corruption were told with greater conviction. Each doubt became truth simply because the empire needed explanations for the shadows gathering around its throne. And so the palace, though still lit with torches and adorned with gold, was filled with an air colder than stone. In that chill, the throne itself seemed less a seat of rule and more a reminder of fragility. A reminder that no matter how vast an empire may grow, it remains tethered to the strength or the weakness of the one who wears its crown. The shadows deepened, and with them, scandal thickened into certainty. For an empire where trust had been drained, perception became reality. And the reality that now spread across halls and markets alike was that the throne, once eternal, stood in peril, not from the blow of enemies, but from the quiet weight of doubt pressing upon it from every side. Amid the growing unease that cloaked the empire, there lingered another current of unrest, one not whispered in palaces or plotted in councils, but murmured in temples and carried through the streets. For centuries, priests had served as the silent architects of authority, their rituals binding the people's faith to the throne, their blessings giving divine weight to laws and wars alike. But when faith itself grew fragile, the foundation of priestly influence began to crack, and the sound of that crumbling echoed louder than the toll of any bell. The temples had long been places where certainty was shaped. Incense rose to ceilings painted with stars, chants repeated words older than memory, and people left with the comfort that the empire's order reflected heaven's will. Yet when rumours of corruption reached the altars, that comfort was disturbed. Whispers spread that offerings were miscounted, that sacred treasuries funded private banquets, that priests who vowed poverty lived in secret luxury. Such whispers, once unthinkable, became irresistible once the throne itself appeared weakened. Doubt, having found entry, spread quickly through the veins of faith. The scandals were quiet at first, small enough to be denied. A priest caught gambling in a marketplace, another seen feasting in secret with merchants he was meant to condemn. But soon the quiet grew into an unmanageable chorus. Families who once emptied their purses for blessings began to withhold coin. Attendance at rituals thinned. Where once thousands knelt, now only a scattering remained. The sacred songs echoed differently in half-empty halls, sounding less eternal and more uncertain, as though even the gods themselves had turned their ears away. In the capital, priests still carried themselves with the weight of tradition, but that weight no longer impressed. Citizens who once lowered their gaze now stared openly. Authority clothed in robes of divinity began to look more like a costume. The rituals themselves, once unquestioned, grew suspect. Did the rain fall because a sacrifice was made, or because the season simply demanded it? Did the harvest grow from blessing, or from soil? When faith in the divine order faltered, the very scaffolding of empire trembled with it. The scandal of lost belief was not confined to temples alone. It spread into households and markets, into the language of daily exchange. When a priest walked by, laughter followed too closely. When an offering was requested, excuses multiplied. The sacred calendar was ignored. The festivals once uniting the people became occasions for satire. Where there had once been reverence, there was now suspicion, and suspicion soon hardened into indifference. This transformation was more dangerous than open revolt, for it hollowed the empire from within. Without faith, obedience became less natural. Without ritual, loyalty grew thinner. And without the priests, the throne stood exposed, lacking the invisible web that had once tied crown and cosmos together. The emperor might still command armies, but armies alone could not restore belief. They could not force prayers into mouths or trust into hearts. Those who once sought divine favour began to look elsewhere for guidance. Fortune tellers appeared in crowded streets, offering charms and muttered prophecies. Foreign cults found followers in neglected corners of the city. What had once been a unified rhythm of faith became a fractured chorus of competing voices. The empire no longer shared one story of the gods. It wandered among many, none strong enough to bind it as before. The priests, desperate to preserve their standing, grew louder, their ceremonies more extravagant. Fires burned higher, sacrifices became grander, yet each attempt to prove their relevance only revealed their fading grip. Gold once placed upon the altar was redirected toward the actors and dancers who mocked them in taverns. The sacred was being outshone by the profane, and the people preferred the laughter of parody to the solemnity of devotion. In this decline, another scandal emerged, crueler than the rest. When their power faltered, some priests chose to align themselves with factions at court, trading blessings for promises of protection. Divinity became a currency, exchanged like coin for political gain. It was no longer heaven's voice that echoed through the temple halls, but the ambitions of men in robes, each one claiming the gods favoured his allies. Sacred authority became a mask for worldly schemes, and the people saw through it. The throne suffered deeply from this erosion. For as long as priests were respected, emperors could borrow the glow of the divine, appearing less as men and more as chosen guardians of a cosmic order. Without that glow, the crown seemed bare, stripped of its heavenly sanction. What remained was only power, raw, unblessed, mortal. And mortal power, unlike sacred power, could be doubted, questioned, resisted. Thus the fall of the priests was not simply the loss of one class, but the unravelling of an entire system of belief that had sustained empire for generations. It was a scandal beyond the gossip of courts or the whispers of betrayal. It was a scandal that touched the unseen realm of meaning itself. When people no longer believed their rulers ruled with the gods beside them, the empire's very purpose was thrown into question. Temples still stood, incense still rose, chants still echoed in dim light. But the faith that once made them unshakable had drained away. What remained were structures without spirit, rituals without conviction, a priesthood without power, and in their fading, the empire lost its shield of the sacred, left to face the world with only its frail, human hands. The shadows thickened not only over the throne, but over the altars themselves. Where once empire and faith had been one, now both stumbled separately, weakened, uncertain, and vulnerable to the same fate. The empire, stripped of its sacred certainty, tried to mask its fragility beneath the glow of feasts. If the temples no longer bound hearts, perhaps the banquet halls could distract them. Wine was poured as though the barrels would never empty. Tables bent beneath the weight of delicacies gathered from every corner of the realm, and musicians played until their fingers ached. Yet for all the glitter, the banquets revealed more truth than concealment. They were the empire's mirror, reflecting indulgence in the face of decline. The halls were magnificent. Chandeliers scattered light over polished floors. Gilded cups caught the flicker of torchlight, and silks in every colour swept past in endless procession. But beneath the splendour, unease pressed against the walls. Laughter was too loud, as if forcing itself to drown the silence outside. Toasts were too frequent, masking the fact that each man at the table measured not joy, but advantage. It was here, more than in the council chambers or battlefields, that the empire's unravelling could be seen most clearly. For the banquets became stages where loyalty was bought, alliances sealed, and betrayals arranged with the clink of goblets. The scandals whispered in corners now spilled into plain sight, woven into the very ceremonies meant to display unity. Every plate carried not only food, but meaning. Every seat chosen was a signal, every absence a warning. The emperor, though still at the head of the table, no longer commanded its centre. Attention drifted elsewhere, to powerful generals whispering over cups, to ambitious princes trading glances, to courtiers whose smiles concealed sharpened intentions. The crown glittered above, but its light was dim, drowned in the glow of countless other ambitions sparkling across the table. Food became excess, a kind of performance. Platters of roasted game, pyramids of fruit, oceans of spiced wine, each course announced wealth even as the treasury thinned. Merchants who supplied the feasts grew rich, while soldiers on distant borders went unpaid. The more unstable the empire became, the more extravagant the banquets grew, as though drowning in indulgence could silence the reality gnawing at the edges of power. Yet indulgence could not hide scandal. Stories of debauchery at feasts travelled faster than decrees. The people heard of dancers brought from distant lands, of courtiers wagering entire estates on a single throw of dice, of drunken arguments spilling into duels before dawn. These tales, embroidered with each telling, spread through streets already weary of priestly corruption and imperial weakness. The banquets became not symbols of strength, but evidence of decay. And within the halls themselves, danger lingered. Poisoned cups, whispered threats, daggers hidden in folds of robes. Feasts became battlegrounds, fought with subtler weapons. A glance across the table could mean life or death. A misplaced word could invite ruin. Where once the banquet had united ruler and subjects in shared celebration, now it was a place of fear, of vigilance, of watching shadows move too quickly under candlelight. The empire's wealth was consumed in these nights. Gold coins disappeared into games, treasures given as gifts to flatter favourites, provinces mortgaged to sustain the illusion of endless abundance. It was not conquest or famine that hollowed the treasury, but the relentless hunger of the court, feasting while the world beyond the palace walls grew restless. Yet perhaps the greatest scandal was not in the waste of wealth or the plotting of factions, but in the emptiness of it all. For beneath the music and the laughter, beneath the clatter of dishes and the rhythm of dancing feet, lay the unspoken knowledge that this was not celebration, but farewell. The banquets were not triumphs. They were distractions, glowing embers before the inevitable dark. The empire's strength had once been its discipline, its faith, its unity. Now, All three had drained away, replaced by indulgence that tried and failed to disguise fear. The halls shone with brilliance, but brilliance can blind as easily as it can illuminate. And in that blindness, the empire stumbled closer toward its end. The feasts grew louder, the nights longer, the scandals sharper. Yet when dawn broke, the light revealed only shadows stretching longer across the throne. While the banquet halls blazed with firelight and laughter, the streets beyond told another story. The city, once a unified heart that beat with the rhythm of empire, had grown restless. It was no longer bound together by the chants of priests or the commands of kings. Instead, it pulsed with rival desires. Each quarter, each family, each faction pulling in a different direction, tearing at the fabric that had once held them as one. At first glance, the city looked the same as it always had. Market stalls still overflowed with spices and silks. Ships still unloaded cargo at crowded harbours, and the cries of merchants still filled the air. But beneath this familiar surface lay fracture. A stranger could walk its streets and see nothing but abundance, yet anyone who listened closely would hear it. The constant hum of arguments, the muttered resentments, the sudden bursts of anger when neighbours collided. Desire, unchecked, had turned inwards, and the city no longer spoke with a single voice. Part of the division lay in wealth. The palaces and villas glittered with extravagance, their residents drunk on excess, while just beyond their gates, poverty deepened. Bread grew dearer, rents rose, and commoners grumbled that while nobles squandered coin on feasts, the poor shouldered the weight of survival. Resentment filled taverns, whispered over cups of watered wine, spilled into the marketplaces where vendors accused officials of hoarding grain. Desire for survival clashed against the desire for luxury, and the gulf between them widened each passing day. Yet it was not only wealth that divided the city, but loyalty. With the priests discredited and the emperor weakened, every faction sought new anchors. Some pledged themselves to generals, seeing strength in the sword. Others followed wealthy patrons, believing coin offered stability. Still others turned to foreign cults and secret societies, hunting for meaning in a world where old gods had grown silent. Desire for protection, desire for faith, desire for opportunity. Each carved the city into separate camps, none willing to bend to another. The streets themselves became maps of division. One district hung banners for one faction, its walls daubed with symbols of loyalty. Another swore fealty to a rival, its alleyways filled with guards in different colours. Between them lay markets where arguments became riots, where merchants closed stalls for fear that customers' quarrels would spill into violence. Even celebrations turned into confrontations. A wedding procession, once a moment of joy, could ignite a brawl if the wrong insignia was carried past the wrong neighbourhood. The emperor, watching from his palace, tried to command unity, but his decrees reached the streets as faint echoes. His words no longer carried the weight of authority. The people heard them as noise, distant and irrelevant. They trusted only what they could touch, the protection of local patrons, the promises of charismatic leaders, the comfort of neighbours who shared their desire. The throne, for all its splendour, became another faction among many, its crown no more persuasive than a painted emblem on a wall. Scandal fed the fire. Stories spread of officials selling favours, of soldiers hired out as private guards, of senators scheming openly in their villas, while riots raged beyond their doors. Every rumour sharpened resentment. Every revelation widened the fractures. What once might have been dismissed as idle gossip now carried the weight of truth, because the people wanted it to be true. In a city divided by desire, scandal was not a disruption, but a weapon wielded freely to weaken rivals. At night, the division was most visible. Torches lit different neighbourhoods in different hues, music and chants rising from competing feasts and gatherings. The city no longer shared one rhythm. It pulsed with 100, each pulling against the other. Some nights, when tensions boiled, fires broke out, and shouts carried until dawn. The watchmen, uncertain of loyalty themselves, often turned away, unwilling to risk their lives for an empire that no longer paid them or for neighbours who no longer respected them. The desire for dominance soon overshadowed all else. It was no longer about food or faith, loyalty or survival. It was about who would claim the city itself. Every group imagined itself as the rightful heir to its streets. Every faction dreamed of bending the city to its will. Yet in chasing these desires, they tore apart the very foundation that made those dreams possible. For a city divided cannot protect itself, and those who fight over its pieces rarely notice the cracks widening beneath their feet. In the midst of this fracture, the city's grandeur faded. Statues stood neglected, their faces smeared with soot. Roads once polished with processions crumbled under neglect. Public fountains dried, their water redirected to private estates. The empire's heart no longer pulsed with life, but staggered under the strain of division. What had once been a beacon of order now flickered with chaos, its glow dimmed not by foreign invasion, but by its own competing desires. And yet, within this decline, life continued. Markets still opened. Lovers still met in shadowed alleys. Children still played in courtyards. But their laughter carried differently, strained, as if aware that the ground beneath them was shifting. They lived in a city whose days of unity were gone, where desire had ceased to bind and now only divided. The empire, looking upon its jewel, no longer saw a city shining in strength, but a mirror of its own unravelling. For what is a throne without priests? What is a crown without loyalty? What is a city when its people no longer share one heart? Desire had once built it, had filled its streets with wealth and wonder. But desire, unchecked and divided, now hollowed it, leaving only fragments where once stood the unshakable. The city, fractured by desire, cast its shadow on the palace itself. Inside those guarded walls, another fracture ran even deeper, one not of streets or districts, but of bloodlines. For what could be more dangerous to an empire than a throne without heirs? The line of succession, once a chain of certainty, had grown tangled. Princes quarrelled over legitimacy, daughters were dismissed or married into rival courts, and children born in whispers were denied or concealed. The emperor, whose body bore the weight of years and wounds, sat upon a throne that trembled not only from rebellion in the streets, but from the question of who would sit upon it next. Scandals swirled around the palace nurseries and chambers where heirs were supposed to be raised. Concubines and queens alike wove intrigues, each claiming their child's right above another. Midwives became witnesses to conspiracies, scribes altered birth records, and astrologers sold favourable omens for coin. In the silence of guarded rooms, infants were said to vanish, their cradles left empty before dawn. Others, too fragile for survival, were paraded briefly as heirs before being carried away, their short lives turned into tools of ambition. The court, instead of securing the future, tore itself apart over the present. Ministers pledged themselves to one claimant, generals to another. Every alliance was fragile, every oath temporary. The empire's most powerful men and women spent more time plotting who might wear the crown than protecting the crown itself. Meanwhile, the emperor, wounded, weary, suspicious, watched with faltering strength. He had once believed his bloodline would outlast stone, that the throne would pass as naturally as the seasons. Now he saw only shadows hovering over it, hands stretching from every direction, each one eager to seize what would one day be empty. The people, too, whispered about heirs. In taverns and marketplaces, they debated which prince, which general, which bastard child of the palace might ascend. Their voices carried both hope and dread, for they knew the wrong heir could doom them all. A throne without heirs was not merely a royal concern, it was a wound that split the empire itself. The scandal of succession was not hidden, it was performed in the open. Banquets turned into showcases of rival heirs, processions into contests of loyalty. Every public gesture was a declaration, every silence a betrayal. The throne no longer appeared eternal but fragile, balanced precariously on arguments of legitimacy and the shifting sands of rumour. And so, as the emperor aged, the empire aged with him. His unseen wound mirrored by the wound of a future uncertain. Armies marched with less conviction, cities pledged loyalty with hesitation, and foreign powers lingered at the borders waiting. They knew that when a throne has no heir, the struggle for it becomes bloodier than any war. Inside the palace, mothers wept, lovers schemed, servants carried secrets heavier than their trays of wine. The throne still gleamed in the torchlight, but it was a seat no one trusted, a promise no one could secure. An empire without heirs is not merely a dynasty in danger, it is an empire that begins to forget itself. For when the line of succession falters, so too does the belief that tomorrow will resemble today. And in that doubt, the seeds of collapse take root, as surely as in battlefields or banquet halls. The throne remained upright, but empty of certainty, its shadow stretching long across a realm already weary of scandal and division. The throne that once dazzled in gold now sat in shadow, its edges dulled by neglect. Around it, the halls of power lay quiet, stripped of the laughter, arguments, and schemes that had once filled their air. Where courtiers once jostled for influence, dust gathered. Where armies had sworn loyalty, banners sagged against stone. What remained was silence, not the calm silence of peace, but the hollow silence that follows collapse. The city, long divided by desire, seemed to hold its breath. The torches that once burned through the night were extinguished. The grand banquets that had flaunted excess were forgotten, their tables empty. The chants of priests no longer echoed through temple halls, for the priests themselves had been scattered or scorned. Streets that had once overflowed with clamour now rang with footsteps of scavengers, and the cries of children too hungry to play. The empire had not fallen in a single moment. It had eroded, scandal by scandal, betrayal by betrayal, until nothing strong remained. Foreign envoys arrived, but no emperor came to greet them. Instead, they found courtyards overgrown, fountains dry, guards leaning on their spears with eyes dulled by fatigue. They returned home with tales not of conquest, but of ruin, of a once mighty realm reduced to whispers and ash. Neighbours who once feared its armies now debated how to divide its lands. For an empire that had ruled by grandeur, the greatest humiliation was not defeat in battle, but being ignored. The silence stretched across provinces. Governors, left without guidance, declared themselves rulers of their own small domains. Soldiers who had once marched in perfect order now sold their swords to the highest bidder. Farmers stopped sending grain to a capital that no longer answered. What had been an empire was now only fragments, each one surviving in its own way, each one drifting further from the whole. Among the ruins, memories lingered. The people still remembered the feasts, the rituals, the crowns, but they spoke of them as one speaks of dreams, bright, distant, uncertain. For scandal had not only destroyed trust in rulers, it had destroyed belief in permanence itself. What had seemed eternal now lay broken, and the silence pressed upon every household like a weight. Yet silence has its own power. Without the noise of courts and temples, the people began to notice what had long been hidden. The stars above the city, the sound of rivers moving beyond its walls, the way life continued in small, unshaken rhythms. A baker still lit his oven each morning. A shepherd still led his flock at dawn. A mother still sang to her child in the dark. The empire had collapsed, but the world had not ended, and so the silence, though heavy, was not absolute despair. It was the silence of endings, yes, but also of beginnings unspoken. The scandals that had destroyed great empires left scars, yet from those scars new shapes would one day grow. The throne was empty, but the earth beneath it remained, waiting for the weight of new rulers, new faiths, new ambitions. Still, in that moment of stillness, the lesson lingered. Power built on secrets cannot endure. Authority fed by scandal rots from within. Desire, when divided, destroys the very heart it once sustained. And when the fall comes, it comes not with the clash of armies or the roar of fire, but with silence, the silence after the fall, when all the noise has burned itself out. The city lay under that silence, a monument to what once was and what had been lost. Stones cracked, walls crumbled, ivy climbed over arches where emperors once paraded. Time moved gently over the ruins, softening them, carrying the scandals into memory. And as the silence deepened, the empire became not a living power, but a story whispered by those who remained, whispered slowly, like a lullaby, drifting into the night. As the candlelight fades from our minds, we find ourselves walking slowly through those quiet corridors once more. The palaces are empty now, their echoes lingering like sighs from a long-forgotten past. Secrets have been whispered, tables have been cleared, thrones sit unoccupied, and the shadows of ambition drift silently through the halls. We have seen how whispers can twist the fate of empires, how desire can divide, how loyalty can falter, and how the smallest scandals ripple into the collapse of the greatest powers. Take a moment and let the stillness settle over you. Let the soft weight of history rest on your thoughts. As you listen quietly, consider, what did we truly witness in these hidden corners? Was it merely the fragility of rulers, or something deeper? A reflection of how even the mightiest can unravel under the pressure of secrets and human desire. The stories may have been centuries old, yet their echoes reach us still, reminding us that the rise and fall of empires is never just a tale of armies and battles. And now, before the last whispers of this night drift away completely, we want to hear from you. What stood out most in our journey through these hidden scandals? Which moments of betrayal, intrigue, or secret ambition lingered in your mind? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us explore together the quiet patterns that history hides beneath its grandeur. Finally, if this journey into the softer, sleepier corners of the past has brought a new layer of quiet fascination to your evening, let us guide more stories into your nights. Subscribe to the channel so the next empire, the next scandal, the next whispered secret can find its way to you. Each story waits patiently, and with your presence, it will continue to drift softly across time, reaching ears ready to listen and minds ready to wander. Sleep lightly, and remember, the loudest echoes are often born in silence.